Shortly after 6:14 a.m., federal agents began executing a series of search warrants tied to a classified documents investigation that had been building quietly for months. This was not a spontaneous enforcement action. It was the culmination of a timeline that, when reconstructed carefully, shows a steady escalation from document recovery efforts to criminal inquiry and finally to coordinated searches at multiple properties. The first key phase did not begin with a raid. It began with record reconciliation. Federal archival authorities identified missing presidential records believed to contain classified markings. A formal request for their return was issued. That request resulted in the transfer of multiple containers back into federal custody. During review of those materials, officials discovered documents bearing classification designations, including high-level markings. At that point, the matter shifted from administrative recovery to investigative review. When classified markings appear outside authorized channels, the issue is no longer record-keeping compliance. It becomes a national defense matter. Investigators initiated a structured inquiry to determine whether additional materials remained outside government custody. In response to follow-up communication, written assurances were provided indicating that remaining documents had been returned. However, investigators received information suggesting otherwise. According to evidence later presented in court filings, a witness with direct knowledge indicated that additional containers remained at private locations. That information altered the investigative posture significantly. Rather than relying solely on voluntary compliance, prosecutors sought compulsory process. A federal grand jury issued a subpoena demanding production of any remaining classified materials. The issuance of a subpoena represents a formal legal threshold. At that moment, compliance becomes mandatory, and representations made in response carry legal consequences. Subsequently, additional containers were produced, along with a sworn certification stating that a diligent search had been conducted and that no further classified documents remained. Investigators, however, were developing evidence that contradicted that certification. Surveillance records, witness accounts, and internal communications reportedly indicated that containers had been moved after the subpoena was issued. This sequence is central to understanding why search warrants were later authorized. Search warrants require probable cause. Prosecutors must present a federal magistrate with evidence demonstrating a fair probability that contraband or evidence of a crime will be found at specified locations. In this case, the affidavit would have outlined the initial recovery, the subpoena, the certification, and the subsequent evidence suggesting continued retention and potential concealment. By the time agents arrived at the first property in the early morning hours, the investigation had moved beyond voluntary recovery and into enforcement. What unfolded next must be evaluated not as an isolated event, but as the final stage of a documented escalation driven by evidence, judicial review, and statutory obligations governing national defense information. The first search location was a private estate in Palm Beach. Agents arrived with judicial authorization shortly after sunrise. The warrant permitted examination of any area where documents could reasonably be stored, including offices, storage rooms, personal quarters, and secured containers. Forensic specialists accompanied the entry team to ensure that any materials recovered would be preserved according to evidentiary standards required for potential prosecution. Over the course of several hours, agents cataloged and removed dozens of containers. Among the items reportedly recovered were folders marked Top Secret. That classification level is reserved for information whose unauthorized disclosure could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. The presence of such markings at a private residence immediately elevates investigative concern, not because of optics, but because of risk assessment protocols triggered inside the intelligence community. Simultaneously, a second search was conducted at a storage facility in Northern Virginia. Investigators had identified this site after receiving information that materials had been relocated. The timing of that relocation, particularly if it occurred after issuance of a subpoena, is a central investigative detail. When agents executed the warrant at this facility, they recovered additional containers bearing classified designations. Several documents reportedly carried sensitive compartmented information markings, which indicate material that must be accessed only within accredited secure facilities. The third site was a private office space in New York. There, agents located further classified documents, including materials associated with foreign intelligence collection. According to investigative summaries, some records referenced human intelligence assets. Exposure of such identities can carry operational consequences, including risk to individuals and disruption of intelligence channels. Taken together, the multi-site recoveries suggest a distribution pattern rather than isolated storage. For investigators, location matters. When classified materials appear in multiple jurisdictions, it expands the factual matrix prosecutors must analyze. Each movement of a container, each communication about relocation, and each certification submitted to authorities becomes a potential evidentiary component. At this stage, the investigative focus shifts to forensic review. Digital storage devices seized during the searches will undergo examination to determine access history, file transfers, and metadata timestamps. Physical documents will be assessed for classification validity, origin, and relevance to national defense. Intelligence agencies may conduct damage assessments to evaluate whether exposure risk exists. The investigative breakdown therefore centers on three interconnected questions. What was retained? When was it moved? And what representations were made to federal authorities during the recovery process? The answers to those questions will shape charging decisions. Prosecutors must determine not only whether unauthorized possession occurred, but whether evidence demonstrates willful retention or obstruction. That assessment will ultimately guide whether the case proceeds from investigation into formal indictment. The statutory framework governing this investigation is precise. The primary provision under review is Title 18, United States Code, Section 793, which addresses the unlawful retention of national defense information. To evaluate exposure under that statute, prosecutors must assess three essential elements supported by admissible evidence. First, the materials must qualify as national defense information. Classification markings, such as top secret and sensitive compartmented information, are not merely labels. They indicate that the documents were produced within the intelligence or defense apparatus and contain information whose unauthorized disclosure could damage national security. Investigators will rely on classification authorities and agency affidavits to confirm the status of each document at the time of seizure. Second, possession must be unauthorized. Authorization is not permanent. It attaches to office and official function. Once an individual departs government service, custodial authority over classified materials transfers to designated federal repositories. Prosecutors will analyze whether any lawful basis existed for continued possession at private residences or storage facilities. Absent documented authorization, retention outside secure government control may satisfy this element. Third, the retention must be willful. Willfulness requires proof that the individual knew the conduct was improper and intentionally retained the materials despite that knowledge. This is where the investigative timeline becomes critical. Formal requests for return, issuance of a grand jury subpoena, and submission of sworn certifications all establish notice. If evidence demonstrates that materials were moved or concealed after such notice, prosecutors may argue that intent is supported by conduct. Separate from retention, investigators are evaluating potential obstruction. Obstruction statutes apply when a person corruptly impedes or attempts to impede an official proceeding. If containers were relocated after a subpoena was issued, or if representations to investigators were materially false, those acts could constitute independent violations. Electronic communications, witness testimony, and surveillance records will be central to this analysis. The investigative breakdown also includes procedural safeguards. Any prosecution involving classified information will proceed under the Classified Information Procedures Act. That statute allows courts to manage sensitive evidence through protective orders, in-camera review, and substitutions designed to protect intelligence equities while preserving the defendant's rights. The existence of compartmented materials suggests that such procedures would likely be invoked. From an evidentiary standpoint, the government's case will hinge not only on what was found, but on chronology and intent. Defense arguments may focus on authority, declassification claims, or challenges to the sufficiency of probable cause. Courts will evaluate those arguments through established legal standards rather than public narrative. Ultimately, prosecutors must decide whether the admissible evidence establishes each statutory element beyond a reasonable doubt. That decision will determine whether the matter remains investigative or advances into formal criminal proceedings. As the investigation advances, the immediate focus shifts from recovery to prosecutorial evaluation. Agents are now engaged in systematic cataloging of every document seized, cross-referencing classification markings with originating agencies, and documenting chain of custody. This process is meticulous because any future prosecution will depend on precise authentication and admissibility. Digital forensic teams will analyze electronic storage devices to determine whether classified files were opened, copied, transferred, or transmitted. Metadata can establish access dates and user activity. If investigators identify communications discussing movement of containers or strategies for responding to subpoenas, those records may become central to proving intent. Timeline reconstruction is therefore not peripheral, it is foundational. Within weeks, prosecutors must decide whether to present the matter to a federal grand jury. Grand jurors will review evidence in closed session, hear testimony from agents and subject matter experts, and determine whether probable cause supports indictment. Their role is not to weigh political implications, but to assess whether statutory violations appear supported by facts. Should an indictment issue, the case will transition into structured litigation. The defendant would be arraigned, charges would be formally read, and pretrial motions would begin. Defense counsel may challenge search warrants, dispute classification status, or argue lack of intent. Courts will evaluate those claims under established constitutional standards, including Fourth Amendment protections and due process guarantees. Beyond courtroom procedure, national security agencies will continue conducting damage assessments. If any seized materials involve human intelligence sources or sensitive defense programs, analysts must determine whether exposure occurred and whether remedial measures are necessary. That parallel assessment underscores why unauthorized retention of classified information is treated with particular seriousness under federal law. The broader institutional question is not about personality or politics. It concerns the integrity of custodial systems designed to safeguard state secrets. Classification protocols, archival statutes, and criminal provisions operate together to ensure continuity and accountability. When materials appear outside authorized channels after formal requests and compulsory process, investigators are obligated to examine the matter thoroughly. From an investigative standpoint, the decisive factors will be documentation and chronology. What requests were made? What responses were provided? What actions followed? Each stage creates a record. Prosecutors must evaluate whether that record demonstrates inadvertent error, administrative dispute, or intentional retention coupled with obstruction. The next public milestone will likely be an announcement regarding charging decisions. Until that moment, the process remains governed by evidentiary standards, judicial oversight, and statutory interpretation. The outcome will ultimately depend not on commentary, but on whether prosecutors conclude that the evidence satisfies every required legal element under federal law.